Police officers who have arrested other police officers. What's the story? Not me, but my dad, who was a cop. He was still working as a full-time cop before switching full-time to firefighting and made a traffic stop around 11 at night back in the mid-80s. Nicer car. Speeding well over the speed limit, so my dad initiates a stop. Before he is out of his cruiser, the driver has what looks like a badge hanging out of the window. My dad walks up, does the usual song and dance, and the driver said, "You obviously can't ducking see who I am." My dad says, "Yes, Lieutenant Colonel, I do, and right now I'm conducting a traffic stop." Turns out the driver was a LT Colonel in the Ohio State Highway Patrol, which is pretty high up in their rank structure. My dad again asks him for license and insurance, and the guy goes off, threatening to call Dickerson D. Celeste, who was governor at the time, and threatening his job, that he was just trying to get back to Columbus after an engagement and so on. Eventually he calls for backup and has another officer there to witness what was going on. Eventually my dad writes him a ticket, and while still screaming, "MR. Perling rank," drives away. The next shift my dad gets called in by his assistant chief and is asked about the stop, and apparently the colonel of OSHP was calling him about it. In the end they had to bring in the other officer to write a statement of what went on, and in the end nothing came of it, except the ticket wasn't contested and paid. Ex-sheriff's deputy here. One night on shift I had the great misfortune to overhear on the radio that a small local chief of police, the whole department was only 3 people, was not answering a radio call. So my shift partner goes out to the call that they were trying to get him to go to, and I make my way to try and locate this chief of police. On my way to the police station, thinking maybe he's just asleep on the couch, I see his squad car pulled off onto the side of the road, lights going. In that moment my heart sank. My first thought was, oh no, this dude just got killed on a traffic stop. As I'm walking up to the car in a hurry, I noticed that he slumped over. I reached into the open driver's window and grabbed his shoulder to try and put my fingers against his neck to feel if he has a pulse or if his skin is still warm, and generally check to see if he is in fact still alive. As I'm doing this I notice a distinct and strong odor of alcohol. As the chief of police wakes up, looks at me, puts the car in drive and pulls away. About that time another deputy pulls up behind my car, and I put out my radio that the chief is driving off. The other deputy, forgetting that we all use a shared frequency, then comes over the radio and says, "Hey, he should be easy to follow, his lights are on." The lights go off. Fast forward to several hours later. Command staff is out at the police department, seizing the weapons and evidence that's stored within the department. This chief of police shows up with the mayor of the small town and submits himself to a breathalyzer. He barely passes. Fun fact: district attorneys do not like prosecuting chiefs of police, especially when politics are starting to get involved. Unrelated to that, I was let go about 2 weeks later for calling a suspect an asshole. Unprofessional conduct. This was during my time as a United States Marine Corps MP. Never arrested another police officer during my other gigs. Got a phone call from the guy's wife saying he was drunk and refusing to leave the house. Knocked on the front door, but found him crying on the porch about his wife leaving him because she wasn't happy anymore. She walked by the porch and motioned for me to come inside through the glass door. She proceeded to show me the red marks on her throat, the hole in the door that he punched through beside her head, and some other evidence that doesn't need to be disclosed. After asking him to come inside and get dressed, he refused to leave with me. I wasn't going to handcuff him in front of his kid, but he decided to take that moment to run from me. He was faster and got away for about 5 minutes before I found him walking through a playground a couple building over. Caught up to him. He punched me, but was taken into custody after a slight use of force. On the way to the station he tried to kick out a window in my cruiser and told me I was ruining his life. He ended up getting charged with about 7 different charges and was kicked out of the Marines. On his way out he lied and sis and got an investigation opened on me for rape. Investigation was completed thoroughly, and all charges against me were marked as unsubstantiated, but the charges still showed up after I got out and went through a background check for my security clearance. 10/10. Would do again. My slight inconvenience was totally worth it for him to go down for domestic assault charges. Edit for clarification. The abuse charges that he falsified were by him stating that he, quote unquote, Heard Greg LX Stang raped a girl at the Marine Corps ball due to a law passed in 2013. All military sexual assault allegations have to be investigated by a Title 18 law enforcement agency, outside federal agency, and SIS was the one that took my case and subsequently cleared me. Charges are still found on a background check, even though I was cleared 100%. Probationary officer goes on a blind double date with his roommate. Been at the racetrack drinking, so they take the train to downtown. Everyone is pretty drunk, him in particular, maybe to entertain or show off for his date. He is acting goofy, as everyone is getting off the train. He sees some guy bent over tying his shoes. Rocket scientist decides to leapfrog over the guy, only neither of them have much balance. Probationary cop basically jumps over on the guy and drives his face straight into the pavement because he is too drunk and the guy wasn't expecting it. Everyone jumps up and he starts trying to defuse the situation he just caused. Turns out offside guy is a 17-year-old kid heading down to spend the weekend with his grandparents and has 2 broken teeth and a broken nose. The drunk cop starts saying stuff like, "Asai, it's okay. It will be fine. I'm a cop. It's all good." When he realizes the crowd isn't going to let him just walk away, he foot bails and tries to run off. A few guys chase him down and grab him. Cops get called and detain him. I was the on-call detective who was called out at 2230 to handle the case. He refused to answer any questions and was booked in for felony battery, based on the extent of injuries and age of victim. He never made it off probation and resigned. Edit. Since I saw this asked, I figured I would clarify. I wrote up and submitted the packet to the DA for prosecution. Nothing was swept under the rug. Trust me, a guy like this is not wanted on the police department. He was a probationary officer, so it would be easier to terminate him. The case was put through the system by the DA and he ultimately took a plea deal. A plea deal is very common across the entire spectrum of cases, whether it be a vandalism, theft of $1 billion, drug charges or murder. It is probably the most commonly used tool for adjudicating cases. So don't think a plea deal was arranged because he had been a cop. Remember, he was arrested and charged by the same department he was a probationary officer for. Former police officer and correctional officer here. I never actually arrested a fellow cop myself. However, my field training officer was arrested and fired from my former PD twice for drunk and disorderly. Before I worked there, he got his job back twice through union arbitration and, to his credit, gave up drinking. When I was working at the jail, we had a cop who was put into protective custody suicide watch after being arrested for stalking a woman he met on a call. He got obsessed with her and kept bothering her after the fact, and after she reported him, he made threats against her. A fellow CO at my jail was arrested for producing and distributing illegal material. He got girls as young as 9 to send him nude photos, which he distributed on the dark web. He's doing 25 years in prison minimum. He won't be eligible for parole for another 15 years or so. We had 7 officers at the jail beat a disabled inmate and then lie about it on their reports. The shift commander then tried to erase the video. All were fired and arrested, but were later acquitted of all charges. Sad thing was, they were all guilty as hell. My dad was the arresting officer of an undercover narcotics detective for the murder of 2 fellow officers. From what I remember, the 2 officers and a technician caught him by surprise while he was stealing from an evidence room. He shot the 2 officers first and his firearm jammed, so the technician escaped. Detective got life in prison and died there. I actually have had to arrest 3 separate members of the justice system this year. First, a practicing lawyer and former judge who had been utilizing his position to coerce 6 from defendants. He utilized this leverage even after he was not a judge anymore. Investigation by DCI revealed he had about a dozen victims, so a warrant for his arrest was made, which I executed. Arresting a guy who used to put defendants in front of is a very odd feeling. He weaseled out of prison time and got it all suspended and put on a direct supervision probation program. Absolute horseshit. I've seen guys do way less get way more time. But it's not really a secret that money has a habit of tipping the scales of justice. Next was a prison guard whom strangled his girlfriend. then stalked her relentlessly. I actually arrested him twice because after he posted bail on the first one he was spotted lurking outside her home only 45 minutes after being released. He's currently in on felony assault, strangulation of a household member, and felony violation of a protection order. He's still in my jail awaiting trial with a bail that has been substantially increased. I'm anticipating prison time for him, but only time will tell. Third was a city police officer. I'm a county deputy sheriff because we received a call from a 6-year-old that his dad was in the garage doing drugs and wouldn't come out. Showed up to find 4 very young kids running around unsupervised. It was a city police officer smoking meth that he had confiscated during a traffic stop and not reported or turned into evidence. DCI took the case from us due to potential conflict of interest and have placed him in another county's jail, and I haven't heard any more about it. Hope he does time too. What kind of asshole leaves his little kids totally alone and unsupervised while they smoke meth? Especially when said person is a duck-in cop. Unforgivable in my opinion. But yeah, 2020 has been a very strange year for me. Saw a true crime video where this police officer killed his ex-wife cause she was trying to divorce him and she had a really nice life insurance. He was struggling hella hard with bills and apparently the crime split the whole police department up. People who thought he was guilty versus people who couldn't believe it and thought he wasn't guilty. In the end he was caught cause he was the only one who had keys to the car she drove, and the police found a paper with calculations on it that were how much he would have left over after the life insurance money paid off his debts in his house. Oh, and he was sleeping around with a co-worker lol. Locked up one for a DUI. Dude was passed out in his car at a red light. He worked for my department. I knew him but not too well. Came up to me and apologized a few months later, which I didn't expect. Nice enough fella. Can't go into much detail but had to book an officer in for taking his female roommate's phone and sending her nudes to his own phone. He then threatened to leak them unless she did sexual favors for him, but she called it in instead. Edit. This really blew up for me, so thank you kind soul for the silver. I would also like to apologize for spelling and grammar mistakes. It's definitely not my strongest subject. I'm an actual cop, so I'll give an answer. I've arrested 12 cops for DUI, 2 of which included charges of possessing weapons while intoxicated. I've arrested 1 cop for writing a check on a closed account, another for violating protection order during a very ugly divorce. I assisted the feds on a couple tax-related arrests. I've also arrested a total of 3 cops for dereliction of duty. One of those cops was a cop who didn't arrest or conduct a DUI investigation after a crash involving another cop. All those cases proceeded in a similar fashion as other people with similar backgrounds, criminal records would have with similar offenses. The slap on the wrist is actually very common and the norm with first-time offenders. Also, the things I've found cops arrested for are generally the same things other middle-class blue-collar workers get in trouble for: issues with substance abuse, particularly alcohol, and financial problems. My career is perfectly fine. I've faced absolutely no negative repercussions from any of my peers. I'd say if you work for a large enough agency you've probably arrested or written a ticket to a cop. I'm from Brazil and I'm not a police officer, but my grandfather was. He was a colonel of the military brigade, Coronel da Polícia Militar in Portuguese, were from north of Brazil, and in the 1960s. In my state's countryside, conflict with Native American people was very common. My grandfather told me the titular officer for the city was capturing Timbira people protesting for their land and torturing them. I remember he specifically saying something about kicking tied up people in their backs till they bleed, putting salt on the wounds and stepping on them with military boots. That detail stuck with me. The thing is, my grandfather's grandmother came from this area. I don't know the right term in English. The same ethnicity, same city. So he had a more sympathetic vision of the Native American people, more than the typical Brazilian police officer from the 60s. He saw what the police force was doing in that city, and when he got called for supervising the conflict, he arrested the guy because he was doing that to men, women and children. The guy was demoted. Some other guy came with the same approach and absolutely nothing changed. That's what my grandfather told me. I don't know if it's true, but it's very plausible in the scenario that I know of Brazil. I'm sorry for the broken English. Guys. Edit. Hey guys. Thanks for your kindness. This is Grandpa and Grandma, and the saber he promised to give it to me, but borrowed to someone and lost it forever. Get a call one night about a domestic. Upon arrival, this woman was bleeding heavily from her face. Said her boyfriend was a cop and he was in the next room. We talked to him and he tells us to how she deserved it. Had to use force on him and get him in custody. Guy had close to 8 years on. Fired on the spot by IAD when they arrived. Duck him. I have no sympathy for women beaters. Thank you to all you Leos who have done this. It serves no one to let cops get off free of punishment. More than once as a kid I'd be riding in the car with my dad, a Leo, and he'd be on his second 6-pack of the day. He'd get pulled over for weaving etc. Then nothing. Dude was driving with 3 minors in the car, drunk enough to get pulled over for it, and let go every time BC he was a Leo too. Still makes me mad. Edit. AWW. Thanks for the awards folks. My first time getting any. The UK has a documentary series called 24 Hours in Police Custody. Series 6 episode 1 covered Bedfordshire police investigating a blackmail case where it turned out that one of the DCs working the case was actually the suspect. Incredible episode and well worth a watch if you can find it. DC's name was Gareth Suffling and he was given a 3-year prison sentence. Edit. Founder. Link to the episode. Not me but an uncle. Arrested an officer from another city for drunk driving claiming to be the head of that city's police department. Head of the offending officer is my other uncle, first uncle's brother, who was actually sitting in my uncle's patrol car before the off-duty police officer was tagged. If both try to arrest the other at the same time, is there a double arrest or a cancellation? Not a police officer but until the proper replies start coming in. Here's a story about a police officer who got sacked for scanning a box of Krispy Kreme donuts or 7p carrots at a self-service checkout. I am a cop for a medium-sized city PD. I have arrested 2 officers for AWE, one from my department. I arrested an LT for domestic assault, and 1 more officer for retail fraud. Never faced any backlash. Wasn't fired or written up. Not a cop but a former dispatcher who filed a complaint against another dispatcher for jeopardizing public and officer safety. This person did not like me and would intentionally withhold information and not enter it into CAD, causing me on radio to have delays in responding to officer questions. When I finally had enough and reported this person to assistant chief, I was sent home. 2 days later I was fired for abandoning post even though I never left. I called both the chief and the assistant chief out during my termination for this being a case of good old boys and collected my personal belongings. To this day people ask me all the time why is it when they call 911 at this particular city they get told hold. My response is usually that dispatcher is most likely finishing their game of Candy Crush first. The thin yellow line, dispatchers, and I hear the thin blue line, cops, are to never be crossed. You're either with them or against them. Edit. I really didn't expect this to get this much attention. To those who say I should report it, at the time yes I should have. But I was devastated to lose that job and my only focus was to find a new job to keep money coming in. At this point I do not know if the dispatcher is there anymore. I know the admins have changed with retirements and mayoral appointments. There is a group mentality to being a dispatcher or a cop. But by and large most do the work because they want to serve their communities. Being a dispatcher even for my short time was both the hardest and also one of the most rewarding things I've done. There are calls I'll never forget both for the sheer horror of them and also for the absolute insanity they brought forth. Thanks to all who read and upvoted this, and please take a moment to consider that the person on the phone when you call 911 or emergency services rarely gets closure when you call. All too often when we send out the appropriate people that's the end for us. There are calls that shake you to the core and forever you wonder, did I do everything I could and are they okay? Not a police officer but I worked as a contractor for a law enforcement's digital evidence lab. There was a new guy who had just retired as a cop but came on because he wanted to do computer forensics and supposedly had some background in it. We were in training together learning about cell phone forensics when he missed a day of training. That night he was on the news because he had been arrested after cops closed in on him for soliciting texts or pictures from underage girls. We weren't part of the investigation but did send his work computer over to the lab that was working on it and he had porn on it. Overall we were all shocked but also couldn't not chuckle at the irony that he was a Compat 6 forensics analyst who didn't know how to hide evidence on a computer. Not a police officer, but I'm a nurse and work intake at a county jail and I've mostly seen officers arrested for domestic violence and DUI. I also worked with a deputy who was arrested for human trafficking. Domestic violence. Not much of a story. Pretty clear cut. Luckily it was a visiting family so not someone I knew. Other than that I once tackled a guy who had been fighting in a bar and threw cuffs on him only to find out later he was a cop. Should have known when he immediately put his hands behind his back when I told him to do so instead of fighting me as drunks tend to do. Detained but didn't arrest him because I didn't actually see him punch anyone and disorderly conduct has a lot of discretion involved, and I don't know who started it. Gave both parties the information needed to file charges against the other and a report was completed. Just a reminder that an arrest is not supposed to be a punishment. Being charged with a crime is the issue. I think DUI is the most common. I never did much traffic enforcement. I arrested 4 separate officers during my career. All 4 were 6 crimes. To be fair, special victims were my forte and internal investigations fell under my title so it just shook out that way. Not me but my brother. There have been a couple of DUIs that he's arrested other cops for, and a fine issued against a cop throwing a house party during lockdown. The most interesting, stupid on the part of the other cop, was arresting a cop for assaulting a police officer. If you're a cop, don't go to a club and get drunk enough to lamp your own sergeant in the face when he's on duty and there to break up the fight you are already in. It won't end well for you. My friend worked as a cop at a local city. He told us a story of how he was nearly arrested by a cop when he was a cop. He and 3 of his fellow officers were having a night of drunken antics related to a bachelor's party. At one point, while definitely intoxicated, his friend decided it was a good idea to throw a hot dog, covered in mustard and ketchup, at a uniformed officer from a neighboring town. Direct hit to the back of the head. Everyone was silent for a second. Then the officer came over and started angrily talking to them. None of them could keep their composure because, well, the alcohol, and the fact that condiments were dripping down this cop's neck as he spoke. Needless to say they were thrown in the drunk tank but never formally charged. Somewhat related, I was reading about how sometimes a wife will leave an abusive cop husband to go to a women's shelter. The problem is that the cops know all the shelters in their area, so sometimes they have to be sent a couple counties over under top secrecy. Not sure if it counts exactly as asked but 2009. I've got a background in law enforcement so as an army officer recovering from combat injuries I found myself as the operations officer for a post-base DES Department of Emergency Services which included the MPs and law enforcement for the post base. My office was across the hall from the actual MP director's office. He stepped in and asked how busy I was. I was busy but wanted any excuse to get away from the monotonous BS I was working on so I said, "Duck it, what do you need, sir?" He was handling a case personally and wanted another officer as witness in documentation and processing. An officer's wife had been convinced to come in by a couple other officers' wives. She was a battered mess. Face was swollen and even though she had cleaned herself up she was hard to look at without just getting pissed. Female officers of course did the actual inspections and physical documentation but the director was running the investigation himself. He had called the officer in off patrol and confronted him with me present as witness. Dude tried joking off that he had just gotten drunk and a little out of control. Long 8-ish month story shortened. His case was transferred to a civilian police department for her good, not from reprisals or anything. For benefits. He was convicted of DV which put him out of the MPs and lost him his ability to own carry a firearm so he was also discharged from the military losing his career. I believe he also served some time in a civilian jail but not 100% sure. She was granted a divorce and because we sent it to a civilian court and he was not court-martialed she still got to keep divorced spouse married for over 10 years benefits for her and the kids instead of losing all benefits. Which is why it was transferred to a civilian department. I really liked the director. He did not tolerate BS from among his officers. DUI'd we see it all the time. In my shortish time in law enforcement I never arrested another cop, although I did arrest correction officers, both for domestic violence related incidents. But I did have several officers I knew well who arrested officers from our agency, and even worked with a couple guys who ended up getting arrested. I only knew of one guy catching flack for arresting a fellow officer. The officer arrested was extremely well liked and the offense was pretty iffy, the kind of thing you wouldn't typically arrest a random person for. However, it came out later that it was just the tip of the iceberg. Most cops I discuss these matters with really have no issue with you if you arrest another cop for legitimate reasons. Professional courtesy is definitely a thing. An officer will likely get the benefit of the doubt. If you commit a borderline act, an officer is likely to turn their head the other way. It's called officer discretion, and most officers will do the same for nurses, teachers, other first responders, or just someone who is kind. But if you have legitimately screwed up, you are most likely going to jail. The cops exist that will do everything they can not to arrest a fellow cop, but they are definitely rarer than the public thinks. Used to work for the police and arrested a few cops. First one was my first shift ever on the beat. I was walking around the city and had a complaint about an abusive guy who was calling women sluts and yelling about how ugly they are. I wasn't too fazed, I thought he was probably just a drunk. As we walked over to speak with the guy, he started yelling about how he was in his right, and we all agreed. You can have an opinion, but just keep things quiet. It was a very simple conversation, and after taking his details to issue a ticket, he just snapped. He threw his briefcase at my partner and kicked him in the junk. Well, we had warrant for arrest, so took him down and cuffed him. As we took him down, his glasses broken on his face and cut him up a bit. Nothing major, so we took him back to the holding cell. At this point he said to me, "Did you know I have a 12-inch cock? And my real name is Joe Big Blow." We all had a laugh. I finally got some time to run his name through the system and boom. Police inspector. This is one of the highest ranks in Vic Paul. So being an inspector, I called my boss. She came in and said, "Oh Doc, this guy used to teach at the academy, then he runs at her and tries to headbutt her. That doesn't go well and he ends up on the ground with a big lump on his head. Someone gave him a wall to headbutt instead. After a few hours he sobered up and was sent home. The court case carried on for 3 years. I've since left the force and he was fired shortly after that altercation." I'm not an officer, but the police officer that worked at my high school then was arrested by his buddies. He was messaging and trying to meet up with an underage boy for 6. Of course he arranged for a time and place to meet up. Got busted by his pals. Had his picture blasted all over the news and at the high school. My cousin was local PD and told me a story about a fellow officer who was molesting his stepdaughter, 11 years old. They asked who was going to arrest him and all of the local PD officers refused, my cousin included. They had to call in the state police after the sheriff's department also refused to arrest. My cousin didn't understand my outrage at the story. My cousin works as a MP in Coast Springs. She arrested 5 other MPs for running a drug smuggling operation using dead soldiers from Afghanistan to smuggle back opiates from the poppy fields. They ducked up. They bought a bunch of nice cars and houses on an MP's salary. All told, in sting operation, 5 MPs, 15 airmen, and a half-bird coal. I have many stories. My dad did internal affairs, not his choice, which I'm sure many aren't. But if anyone is interested, I could type out a couple scenarios that he was a part of. Edit, adding the story here so people can enjoy. They ran what they called integrity tests on suspected officers, from other officers letting them know, breaking the law and abusing the badge. In one such case they put an undercover office. He was a black officer, in a nice car from impound. Had him drive normal down a highway the suspected cop was patrolling. They would put drugs or a bag of money under the driver's seat. There are cameras and microphones placed throughout the vehicle. Upon pulling the UC officer over, they would have him exit the vehicle and search it. Once they found drugs or money, they would take a bunch and stuff it into their vest and then tell him they found nothing and he could continue on his way. In most cases this was thousands and thousands of dollars and or lots of drugs. They allow the officer to finish his shift and before he gets home he is arrested and interrogated. They offer him a choice. Be fired and keep your pension if he can also tell them other officers who do the same thing. Cause some crowds roll together, or not say anything and be fired. No pension and possibly jailed. Either way, never be an officer again. If they honestly didn't know anyone, still lose pension. So that's 1. Thank you. I was sexually assaulted by a retired police officer and no one helped me when I spoke up. I was actually punished for speaking. Still am. I had to relocate to get away. Still was not enough.